So, good afternoon.
Afternoon.
So, I'm going to give a quick introduction on the topic, the API. I think everybody, literally, if I would ask for hands, I would be surprised if I don't see anybody has used an API. I'm 100% certain you have. It's that ubiquitous these days. But it's kind of a synonym for a REST API these days. Although pretty much everything that is interfaceable is kind of an API, if you think about it. Even if you go to your bank clerk, you're interfacing with them. You reach out your credit card form, right? It's essentially an interface. It's not very automated. It's not an application programmable interface, but it is an interface. So if you think around the world, or you think the world in the sense of these interfaces, you see how much interfacing there is going on every day. Now we want to go into these interfaces that we work with more. So we're going to talk about REST. We're going to talk about other forms of APIs. We're going to talk about things that are happening inside companies and outside companies, because let's face it, wherever integration needs to happen is typically at these borders. And before we go deeper into this topic, I want to have Tyson and Hemanth introduce themselves really quick in a few sentences. So maybe you can do that.
In a few sentences. Yes, my name's Tyson Hackwood. I work for Braintree. I started Braintree in Asia as first employee. I actually had left a company called PayPal and joined a startup out of Chicago, and then was acquired by that company. So ended back inside PayPal. So my PayPal career is 6.5 years in total, and yeah, been here for about 2.5 in Singapore.
And still a very technical person, though, in one way or the other, right? Comes with the job.
Yeah, exactly. Sort of technical, yeah, technical enough.
Hemanth.
Yeah, I work with PayPal as a full-stack software engineer, and I'm a free software enthusiast. I've been doing a lot of open source from 2008 or something, things like that. I've been part of large open source projects like Yeoman or Webpack and things like that. So that keeps me running off work, and that's been me so far.
All right. So how did I come up with this topic? Well, it turns out I was actually working for Standard Chartered, as I mentioned, for the last 3 months, and there's a push here in Singapore from the Monetary Authority that every financial institution of a certain size has to open up APIs. And I think that's a pretty interesting move that I've never thought about, that like suddenly we have to deal with government regulations on interfaces we create or something. It's not that bad yet, but like it's just one step away from that. And I'm like, wow, this is crazy. Like, how does that happen? And for those that are not from here, the Singapore government has a scheme or a push called Smart Nation that is going on over the next years, where they want to automate and enhance integratability with big companies, customs, postage services, financial institutions, you name it, to increase the efficiency of the labor, essentially. Because the bank clerk that takes your forms, what are they doing? Who are we kidding? They're just taking a form and typing it into a computer, right? If you take that part out, you might actually end up with less mistakes in the data. It's the human factor. So this is what made me think about it, and I was trying to help them about, okay, how do we set up an API and what is required to do an API? And here we have people that essentially work in businesses who do nothing else but being a really good API. So maybe you want to drag us to the beginnings of Braintree, because I think it was very much set out to be exactly that, a payment platform as a service, and like how you thought about creating a product that is an API.
Well, I think, Braintree had a life as developer for developers for a particular reason. It started with, there were no salespeople in the organization at the start, and weren't for many, many years, because developers have driven the requirements of the product and or service, not just in payments in general. But Braintree has at its core is a requirement to both meet the needs for payments, but probably more importantly, Braintree started with an idea which was it shouldn't be so hard, right? So anyone that's integrated payments here knows that it's not always pleasurable or fun or interesting. Most of the times it's difficult because it's usually from businesses that have been around a very long time and may not have the services that plug in easily. It's usually a push rather than pull concept in payments. Braintree set out to do it differently, not just from even a code base, but also from a commercial base. So again, anyone that's had the joy of starting a startup knows it's not easy to even get a bank account, get your business registered. I mean, it's a lot easier today, but let's think back 7, 8 years ago. Surprising, it doesn't seem that long, but it was and is, has difficulties. So Braintree, like a number of other of the emerging companies in fintech, said it shouldn't be so hard. So at the core, what we believe, and I guess this is what others should build for, is make your product easy, make it accessible, make it something that ships quickly.
So this is essentially user experience, right? That's what you think about if you create a UI on the web or for mobile. It's like you think about, oh, easy, fast, don't overload me, make it a wizard. So is there such a thing like developer experience in that sense?
Oh, it was all developer-led. I mean, each person that came into the business was, not from a bank. They didn't have experience in, fintech services. What they had in experiences were building for other products and finding it hard to integrate a fintech. I mean, look, banks do a great job at many different pillars. When it comes to integration, when it comes to innovation, it hasn't been great for a number of years in many respects, and we often say if they were really good at their job, companies like Braintree shouldn't exist, companies like PayPal shouldn't exist, because they should have got it right a long time ago. The advantage now is we work closely with banks and other financial institutions because, again, it's now that middleware or being invisible and making sure commerce works. So our whole premise, our whole promise is just to make commerce work. Use us because we're quick and easy and we take the pain out of payments and make sure it works, but actually get onto the function which is the most important to you, which is your business. You shouldn't need to be and ever spend that much time on being payment experts.
So yeah, on that topic, Hemanth, you are a proper developer in that sense, working for PayPal, and you integrate with APIs on all times. What's maybe the most painful experience you had with APIs? You don't need to name who it was. It was just what about it is the most annoying piece, so that you, if you build APIs ever, can maybe avoid these things.
Yeah, the most painful part, there are many painful parts, probably I have to talk about the most painful part rather. I think this is very much common, not at any particular company as such, but most of the people who use APIs and integrate them face this issue. One of the major ones being the document is out of sync. Say you have a schema based on which you're trying to build your UI. So you're kind of not assume this use case where the backend isn't ready yet with their services, but you just have the schema with you, and you're building your front end assuming that mocking a response that the backend would give. But sometime down the line, the schema got changed, and once the backend integrates the API, whatever response you get is out of sync. That's one of the major pain factors.
All right, so quality of documentation against interface, obviously, I guess that's for most of us kind of a pain point if it's out of date and not maintained very well, which leads right into the developer program almost, right? Because if you don't have an intentional effort supporting these interfaces that you're building, documenting them well, keeping it up to date, which needs to go hand in hand with the development of the APIs. How do you think about a developer program? That's more for outside-facing APIs rather than inside-facing APIs within your corporation, right? Mm-hmm. What makes a good developer program? Maybe you have examples outside of PayPal Braintree?
Yeah. I would like to quote an interesting node module called Swagger here. I assume few of them are using it already. The advantage of that being is it auto-generates the documents for you as and when you update your schema. You have the document which is reflecting your current schema, right? Something like that would really be advantageous. The other pain factor would be debugging stuff. Say, if I could quote an example of, say that there was a case where there was a missing transaction from a merchant, right? So the merchant has done a transaction, but he doesn't see it in the list of transactions. So how do you go about debugging it? Like at what layer this error did really occur? Was it the API failed to fetch the data from the DB, or did the UI fail to fetch the API, or did the UI misinterpret the API, or did the API misinterpret the data which it fetched from the DB? So there are a lot of combinations and scenarios that can happen there. So debugging some scenarios which you can't reproduce easily becomes very painful at times.
Yeah. So PayPal at the time, I remember, had X.com. Like, funny story, in 2007, I was a certified PayPal engineer. Like, you had to go to all these tests and, fill out forms and answer questions about how the APIs at PayPal work. They did this at the site of their big conferences in the US, and you could sign up for it and go through a bunch of courses, and then you got a certification. It's really funny. Nobody does that anymore, right? Like, open source API interface certificate, and like, now how to do integrate with an open source API or build one in Express or something. But companies did this at the time, and there was a whole range of SDKs which essentially moved the interface from being on the web, like a web service, to like being inside of your code, right? So that you can integrate with a library instead of an API. Now, you can't really say API without what is the most modern trend or most modern, maybe depends on where you are, and how to design any more ambitious application, which would be the microservice architecture. I think 10 years ago they called it SOA, service-oriented architecture. Yeah. I actually have something on that line. I don't know if you remember this. Can we go to the slides really quick? Anybody remember that one? Yeah. It was the gravestone of the misled SOA engineer. Yeah. So.
There was this joke that happened in an interview. Like, I asked the candidate, "Do you use SOAP?" And he was like, he was a pretty young developer, so he's like, "Yeah, I use it every day." Yeah. So like, these are all the buzzwords, I believe. So we had SOAP, and then we had things like, then the REST thing happened, and then we had the full stack thing happening. Then we'll be like serverless, the cloud. I feel it's all the buzzwords, but it's still the old game with a new face. It's just a face, and it will just face out with some other new buzzword. But if you consider future of APIs, it would be more APIs, and probably APIs for APIs.
So is that all going to be HTTP REST? Like, I don't know, like Braintree offers a bunch of APIs. Is that all HTTP REST, or what kind of APIs are there?
Well, it's even a bigger question than me, that's for sure. But the nice part, it's all on the website, you see. So I mean, to the point that. Great. But I mean, I think you bring up more that it's not even just about today. We spend probably more time on making sure that we're available for all the modern platforms and emerging platforms. We also know that there's a lot of legacy out there as well, so we actually look to the communities to build those linkages as well, because there's only so far you can go. And I guess the other aspect, and I think importantly, is there is only so far you can build with a financial service product, especially in payments, because if you go too far into someone else's backyard and there's a problem, we're talking about real money here, so we can actually have a detrimental impact. So I think there's also, if you're looking at the requirement of any sort of service, just always appreciate that they can only go so far before they might go into the wrong side of the house to play with. So we're really conscious that we provide the best version across whatever platform you're playing with, so that you can draw down and create a transaction and monitor and/or protect yourself from fraud and/or capture card details. I mean, look, if you're not doing tokenization in your product, you should have been for 2 or 3 years. So to me, we have plenty of resource. It comes down to making sure you integrate it right, and
it's like it needs to be purpose built, right? In that sense. So I think a good indicator, like I know few companies these days, specifically in Southeast Asia, I maybe know 2. That build APIs as a product, like the so-called platform as a service or integration as a service. Like that's typically a thing we consume or use from companies that came up in Europe or the US. But like here, I have not seen like startups, which is one of the industries that you can't really disconnect from Singapore these days. I haven't seen many come up with a product like that, specifically targeted to enterprises for integratability. It exists for sure, but not as much. So purpose-built, very important part there, and I think a good indicator that it's purpose-built should be the fact that it's already a service you offer, and people are liking it, and they just would like to use it more efficiently. Like, credit card applications, things like that, if banks move into the direction to make these things automations, and Singapore is even talking about having a unified ID, I think it's called MyInfo, that financial institutions can get access to, which I think in other countries would raise every privacy flag on the planet. Here in Singapore, it's like, okay, yeah, we have all the citizen data, why don't we make that available for institutions to use so that they don't need to ask you to fill out your form, you just need to confirm that you would like to share your data with them, and they can get your data set in the most current form from a government institution. It's an interesting way to think about it. And
well, you know, I'm sure for those who shop online, you've actually probably shared more data with a online store than you will your bank or government, yet you feel people feel worried about where the data is. And to a certain point, people should. But I think the responsibility of anyone that's building a service needs to be to make sure the data is protected, have service providers that can protect the data in the best fashion they can. Tokenization is a great first step, especially if you have that secured that's not on site. I think most people know that that's pretty much that's a gone idea. You know, there's no point storing anyone's data centrally or in your own servers anymore. You know, everything needs to be tokenized. But to your point around, you know, building for purpose and for APIs and seeing the growth of APIs, my thing would be that if you are doing that, there's two aspects to a really good API. Usually, it's number one is it's been built for a purpose, but number two, if you build it for your biggest customers or your biggest the biggest service provider that you're working with, there's a high chance that your other customers are going to require the same requirements, or a subset of those will. So if you look at Braintree, a lot of the product and service you see is because one of the customers we've worked with, or many of the customers we work with, have had that requirement. So we build out a lot based on those requirements. So the advantage is that you get to share in a lot of resource and development done by other large organizations. And I think that's what you've got to look at yourselves for anything you're building or using. Make sure it's being built by people that are being used for the next generation, not the previous. Make sure they're built that, you know, if you're using it, that whoever else is using it also likes it and has helped develop it in some format. Now, you're never going to know. We're never going to say, oh, this was built by X or Y, or, you know, this is why this feature set is with ours. You know. But you can pretty much assume it's been built for someone who we've worked with for a while because they see a need. And generally the need is customer-led, and they want their customer to have a better experience.
Do you have something that did you create APIs in your life like yourself that were exposed, like things that developers definitely should take care of when creating an API? I always start with one of mine, which is check whatever is your input data first before you do anything else, and if it's even qualified to do anything for you, and have proper errors. But maybe.
Yeah. So add on, so I would probably vote upon the tokenization, probably have a single sign-ons or OAuth tokens and things like that. And the other one everyone tend to do is have a rate limit on your APIs if you're opening it to the public, so that it's not really misused. And sometimes it gets tricky, right? So you're trying to block them probably on an IP, or they could be switching on dynamic IPs, or probably you're using some combination of that location that they can probably even mock, so they can mock up everything. So it sometimes gets tricky to handle the rate limits on how many requests have been hit on your open APIs. The other one that the other paradigm some of the companies are following, or like Uber, for example, is like on-invite APIs. I don't know how good a design is that. Like you get to use their APIs only on invite. There might be a design. There might be a reason behind. There might be a business decision. That might be a business decision as well. But that's a new paradigm that's opening up on.
Interesting. Now, on the last thing, looking forward, this talk is about 2017, so it's coming up. Maybe some of you have read this. I saw that there are certain websites that have gone to WebSockets for serving advertisements.
Advertisements, yeah.
Yeah, so that it can't be blocked by your ad blocker anymore because it's a socket connection to their default data connection, and it's just that all the advertisements are fed through the WebSocket. So, you know, it's one way of integrating and surrounding things. Like now I read that Firebase has gone back to XMPP because they thought WebSockets was too heavy for what they were doing to have the fast like API that they need to be a real-time database that's cloud-based, right? Where do you see this going?
Yeah. So as I was telling, it's all the buzzwords, and history will kind of repeat itself in a new and a different fashion, like XMPP being one of the examples. Or in the front-end world, we used to say that don't mix up your JavaScript and CSS and keep them all separate. And these days, it's like inline everything. Doesn't matter. The browser is smart enough to figure out what goes where, right? So it's like the history is repeating itself, but in a different fashion and in a more powerful sense. But in terms of APIs, like I feel building with purpose, of course, is the major priority, but building smarter APIs is the new thing. Like if you could quote few companies like Apogee or API.ai, right? They are building smarter APIs that could recognize natural language. It does some natural language processing and return an API in turn. Say, for example, you could just say, set my room temperature to 30 degrees, and it will respond with a JSON saying that this is the current temperature, and this is what I'm setting it to, and this is the device ID, something like that. That's building with purpose, and smarter APIs is a new way, and the way the APIs are going, I feel.
So I'd like to hear from you with your hands again on who is currently working on like exposing some kind of API, Express API, Ruby API, I don't really care, but something that like somebody outside of your department or company needs to integrate with. That would be really interesting for me to see. So it's, yeah, very little actually. So maybe interesting. So the rest is mostly consumer, because I assume like everybody else has at some point used an API or interface to work with, because it's like the common theme. Developer programs, who of those that were developing APIs actually have thought about the ecosystem surrounding this API, how people will interact with it? Like to go back to the point of developer experience, which was part of my engagement. Like how do you work with developers on that sense? So are you thinking about developer programs, or is it literally just an integratable API? Maybe for those that raised the hand on those, can I see a few hands on those that think of it more holistically? That's down to 3 enterprise companies. Great. Speaking of Microsoft, ARM, and Standard Chartered. Great.
To add on, Thomas, especially in PayPal, right? Like we have this concept of inner sourcing. So inner sourcing, as I said, is like how the free and the open source model works. We're trying to integrate the same model within the company. So say for example, we want to work across teams, and the communication across the teams would be very much similar to what happens in an open source project like GitHub. We internally use GitHub as well, the enterprise GitHub. So we could just go and create an issue, ask for them, or say like, hey, your schema says that, but your API is returning this. Yeah. How do we fix it, or how do we go about creating a new attribute in the request?
That's interesting, something we talked about before, right? I guess one of the most common things to use APIs for is you have a front end and then you have a back end. So like show of hands again, just to get a bit more feedback from you guys on who creates fully static front ends that just talk to a back end service. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 hands. Okay, like for me, for the last 2 years, I think it's the way to go forward, in the sense that you disconnect these two quite well. But then we ran into this discussion earlier where you have feature requests coming from the top and they want to have it in the front end, right? And then suddenly the back end doesn't have the functionality. So it needs to trickle down into it, right? And I thought like you guys have a really interesting approach to work with this environment, and maybe you can...
So it's talking about the inner sourcing paradigm, but I still feel one thing that lacks, or I don't know how all of you guys are doing, is when we call ourselves a full stack team, what I feel is like end-to-end, maybe querying the database, generating the API, consuming it, creating the UI. So the end-to-end process should be done by the single team. So the advantage of this would be is like you're not waiting for the other team, or you're not running on assumptions that the API would respond in a certain manner, or the schema would be so and so. So that would be a nice experiment to do, but it's really a hard thing to do when it comes to an enterprise, and there's some legacy code that's running. Then there's a lot of untouched code, like probably fear of touching or breaking or slow moving things. But there, on the contrast, there is a lot of migration that's happening from the legacy stack to the new stack. Like in our case, it's more of C++ and Java to Node, right? So
Interesting. To bring it back to open source, actually, what this conference is in parts about, right? Like great tools in open source that help you creating better interfaces these days.
Like Swagger being one of the very good examples.
Swagger
and,
being one of those. Any contributions or things that Braintree is doing on that line?
Look, I think we've always, as I said, it's a very large developer base. I mean, it's still 80% of the people that work for our business, right, are on the developer side. So we're very developer-led. I think just using any tool available, because I'm guessing there's teams in here that could be quite small, so you don't have the joy of having a large team you can bring together. You may be your only team, or you might be one of two, therefore you are the both back of house, front of house, all of house. Whatever it is, I think it's about working together and trying to ship things that ship products which make sense. So, if you're on an enterprise side, what are the real requirements versus the nice to haves? I think we've got to prioritize. It's probably our biggest challenge is we have no shortage of requirements. What we have a shortage is of time and a shortage of people potentially, or the amount of time that you want to change your code and or make changes in general. So make sure that any changes are worthwhile. Make sure that when you're shipping them that they have a direct impact to the customer, consumer, or whoever the end user is. Just because they seem to be a nice to have for a person in an organization, it's always worth checking, what was it for. I think in anything to do with architecture, from our end, and because I drive from a business requirements, often it's when you ask the question, or if there's deep enough questions, you'll understand what the real requirement is. And again, there is no point reinventing the wheel. Often the answers or the product you've got already exists, you've used it somewhere else. Try and make it, repurpose it or make it fit for purpose. Sometimes you'll have to build it new, but if you're going to build it new, go back into your business or go to the businesses you're talking to and see how many other people could have the same requirement. And I think this is the advantage of being larger, and for the larger organizations, you have this. You have this because you have multiple customers, multiple stakeholders. You have the advantage that, you need to have a voice. You need to say, we're making changes and this is what we're making them for. Who else has this requirement? Because you can build your business case really fast, or alternatively, you can, kill that product or project and focus on something that's far more important. You only have a couple of shots a year or whatever your cycle is to make it work. Make sure it really works.
Thomas, sorry to break, but this just reminded me, 6 or 7 months back, in the Node world specifically, there was this voting done on different clients, or rather node modules that would help you to build RESTful interfaces. And based on a lot of parameters, if I recall it right, it was Restify. There's a module called Restify that kind of won in terms of all the different parameters that was considered in the vote. So along with Swagger, maybe Restify is one of our very good candidates these days.
So I want to leave you with one last message there as well. I think APIs and open source, you should do APIs in open source properly as well. It's like the fact that other people can see your code should not prevent you from also creating great interfaces into your code. Ideally, I don't have to look in your code at all if I want to use something that you're creating, maintaining, or contributing to. And the interface is still well documented, well laid out, and works well, right? That's one thing that I've come over in open source quite often, is that it's I just go in and work around. Specifically, JavaScript kind of invites you to do it, because you can look into any package, you can go around, change prototypes and all this kind of stuff. I think the fact that developers can do this makes those libraries that actually do a really good job in creating interfaces stand out even more.
So just to that, the one thing I would say that I would challenge everyone to do, and if you get the opportunity and you're playing with some of our code, if you see or you're playing with anything to do with our APIs, if you see something you'd like, let us know. Seriously, the best feedback we get is from you. And I think sometimes you hear, why don't you have this and why don't you have that? That's really actually a good question. Don't ever not think to put the feedback in. I think large organizations that are represented here all feel the same way. We don't want to have a back office or people in a room pushing out, this is what our product is. That's the old way of doing things. The new way is, tell us what you think, so we can only go as fast as you tell us of the things you need.
Yeah, and it's quite easy to relate. Whenever you build an interface, you know the guy on the other side is also going to be a developer. So all the pains that you received in the past from integrating with anything is something you shouldn't want to put on the people on the other side that you're building for when creating an interface. They are also developers, and they also like their time and sanity. So please build great APIs, and please contribute more to open source. With that, I want to thank Tyson and Hemanth for being here on the panel as well.
Thank you.
Our
Go
pleasure.
talk to them
Thank you.
outside. A round of applause if you like this.